Hello everybody, welcome to Our Culture Gaming. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello, Scott.
Josh, my friend, on this day, Blasphemous 2's embargo releases is up. Whatever you want to call it. It's a good game, isn't it?
It's a really good game, Scott Tilford. I've fortunately had the chance to be playing this for a few weeks now, you know. This is like how reviews should be done, by the way. We got the code for Blasphemous 2 in well early, and I've actually had it finished for like a week and a half, 2 weeks. So I've had a lot of time to prepare for this, and I've had a lot of time to think about it, and yes, it is a really good game. There's a lot to jump into. This was actually one of my most anticipated games of the year because I was a huge fan of the original Blasphemous, which, if you don't know, is this kind of Metroidvania-style Souls game almost.
Yes.
A 2D kind of like action RPG where you're doing a lot of backtracking and you're fighting a lot of very difficult enemies and very difficult bosses. It's got this gorgeous art style that thankfully carries into Blasphemous 2. An overall really good game, really recommendable game, but you're here to kind of ask us some questions.
I am, because I love the original Blasphemous, and we do have specific things to get to here, but I feel like the combat was extremely chunky and meaty. Some kind of almost Mortal Kombat style fatalities on some of the enemies. You're splitting them in half, doing really cool, like I said, satisfying finishes. The first thing you had written down here was just new abilities and gameplay in general. How much is improved going forward?
Well, this is kind of, it's both good and bad that Blasphemous 2 is essentially more blasphemous. Initially, anyway, before you get these new abilities and before the map opens up a little bit, I was a little bit taken aback by kind of how much of a natural continuation it was.
Right.
I thought there might have been more overhauls to maybe like the combat of the enemies and whatnot. But Blasphemous 2 brings a lot of stuff along from Blasphemous 1, including the main character. But you've also got kind of like enemies that return from Blasphemous 1 as well, and some of the general design is kind of similar, which, you know, might be music to your ears and might be exactly what you wanted if you love the original, because it is of a high quality. But I was kind of initially a little bit too familiar with it. But that said, the game does open up and the game does kind of change and form its own identity once you do unlock these abilities, which I won't necessarily spoil here, but essentially because it is a Metroidvania style game, you're going to be unlocking a lot of new items and a lot of new actions that you can perform along the way that allow you to return to previous areas, backtrack, etc., etc., but they're also integrated into the combat in a really satisfying way, giving you more mobility, giving you more options, and acting is really satisfying rewards for exploring this world, essentially.
I want to know, am I going to finish this game? Is this very hard? How is because difficulty in the modern era, when we talk about Souls-style games, obviously this is kind of in the vein of like a Salt and Sanctuary, like you said, 2D Souls games. They're known for being hard. That's what people are kind of going in for. However, I feel like Elden Ring kind of changed the conversation on that a little bit by giving you the likes of the Ash summons, like little things that you could summon, AIs or whatever, NPC stuff, to help you get through some fights. What does this game do? Or does it not do anything?
Well, here's the thing, right? I thought it was really interesting because when I came away from Blasphemous 2, I was thinking that was way more of a, what you would kind of class as a standard Metroidvania game rather than a Dark Souls game. And then I immediately Googled Blasphemous 2 and saw that IGN was running with that exact same headline. And I was like, oh, thank God, it's not just me. Yeah, the difficulty across the board, like Blasphemous 2 is still, it can be a challenging game. But immediately from the first boss and the first level that I played, maybe it's just my memory, but it didn't seem as punishing and it didn't seem as brutal as the original was, which was very much, in my opinion, more indebted to that Dark Souls formula. Like in Blasphemous 2, you still have the standard bonfire system where you kind of bank your checkpoint, essentially, and then every time you die, you go back to there, and every time you kind of hit another checkpoint, enemies respawn, etc., etc. You've got a limited amount of healing items that you can upgrade, but you're kind of going from checkpoint to checkpoint with that kind of, with those limitations, trying to get through those enemies. I found this way more accessible and way easier because I found that the enemies themselves had nicely telegraphed attacks and only a handful of them that you can kind of get to grips with. It still is, it requires you to think. There is an element of challenge there, especially when it comes to the bosses, which probably will kill you a few times. But generally speaking, I think this game does want to keep you alive way more than the original did. In the original, there were levels that just kind of felt like gauntlets, where I was constantly getting kicked back to the checkpoint, and I felt like I needed to be perfect in my execution to use as little health as possible and to not get attacked by these enemies and get through to the next checkpoint, and I felt like I was rerunning that a lot. I never got that same sense with Blasphemous 2. I felt like the challenge was appropriate, but that I was never stuck on one particular gauntlet for too long.
How is checkpointing in general? Does it mean that you're not like rerunning entire big chunks? Because I always find this is the death knell for me in most, well, not necessarily most, because I still get through them, but Souls games, that idea of like, okay, you've got a corpse run, you got to get all the way back through, you're redoing 5-10 minutes of game time over and over again.
It's gonna depend on your skill. Like, if you have trouble with these games, you probably are going to be rerunning some of those areas over and over again, to the point where you need to get to grips with those enemies that are on that particular stretch of game. But overall, I thought the checkpoints were way more generous again than I remember from Blasphemous 1, especially when it comes to boss fights, which is really great. Like, you're not having to do the kind of original Dark Souls thing of running through a bunch of enemies just to get to the boss. Usually there's a checkpoint that appears right next to the boss room, so you're straight back in every time you die.
Just like Final Fantasy V.
There you go. Which was, music to my ears, because this is a big game. There's a lot to get through. There's a lot of backtracking, like I said, a lot of exploring to be done. And it just keeps the pace up that little bit. I guess it depends what you kind of want from it. If you want that brutal experience, you might not necessarily get it. But if you want a nicely balanced mix of combat and exploration, that's more what this is, I think.
Do you feel like the conversation on that is nearing the next like plateau of like, we want hard games but not impossible games? Like that idea of exploring the validity of cheapness in difficulty and just how much they various games can challenge you, how much are you going to put up with. I'll always take a game that feels like it's designed to be finished and not just pounding me into the ground over and over again. Not to say I haven't finished those games in the past, the Dark Souls, the Bloodborns, everything else, Elden Ring being the last one. However, Elden Ring was the easiest, or is the easiest, of the From Software games so far, and I feel like that in itself, like I mentioned before, has kind of changed the conversation a bit. Just saying, look, you can have your difficulty, but you almost make it optional in regards to, that game. You can choose to bring other characters in, AI things to make it easier. This overall, though, feels like you want to finish it. I know that you like really brutal, tough stuff.
I do.
So I don't know if it's still satisfied you in the same way.
It's interesting that you mentioned Elden Ring, and specifically like the Ash summons, like you mentioned, because what's great about Blasphemous 2 is that it gives you more options in combat to kind of help mitigate the difficulty. Like I said, you've got 3 weapons to acquire over the course of the game, each with their own playstyle. You've got these new abilities that I mentioned that give you more mobility, give you more actions that you can perform. But then you've got like spells, essentially. You've got a heavy spell and a regular spell that uses your fervor meter. So you've got that to kind of help counteract, for instance, groups of enemies. You might be able to call down a lightning strike or something like that. You've got sort of homing missiles and all of these.
You should have opened this on homing missiles.
Well, I probably should have. And all of these spells have like, specific types of damage that they do, whether it's mystic or fire or whatnot. And, that helps against some enemies that might be resistant to a specific type of spell, but are weak to another one. So you've got all of this to think about. And then you've got what's essentially a perk system where you can kind of swap in items that give you buffs. You've got a massive selection of choice there to help you buff defense or buff offense, or tailor it to specific weapons and items that you use a lot, specific types of damage. So there's a lot of stat-based stuff to kind of juggle, but ultimately that just gives your playstyle a little bit more choice, and it helps you mitigate the difficulty, like you mentioned. So it's not just necessarily a skill-based game in the same way that I wouldn't say Elden Ring was, because you've got all of this extra stuff to utilize if you're not necessarily the fastest with your reflexes, or you have difficulty gauging enemy attacks. You've got like a few options in your arsenal to deploy in that way.
The thing that gets in the way for me is by far checkpointing. You saying that you can you're closer to the bosses every time you die makes me go, oh, I might actually finish this one. That'll be nice for a change.
Well, I mean, you've got like a fast travel system as well. You need to find certain like teleportation walls around the world that you can bank, and then every time you need to get to another side of the map, you can like skip to one of those fast travel points and kind of get around the map a bit quicker. It's just kind of cutting that fluff that's in a lot of these games that kind of is just time wasting. It's not completely. It doesn't alleviate it entirely. There are still some sections where, I got kind of lost and I felt like I didn't know where to go next, and I was kind of just searching around the world aimlessly, pulling my hair out thinking I have no idea how I need to get to this objective, but thankfully that was only a couple of times across the whole experience. It's just kind of like it's a tighter game, it's a more straightforward game, and it's a more accessible game, I think, overall, and it's a bigger game as well, which makes all of those changes to me really work.
The thing is, there's so many games this year. Obviously, that is the big talking point this year of just how relentless everything has been. And this wasn't necessarily on my radar. I love the first Blasphemous to a point, but then I just didn't finish it. Like you just said, I ended up getting lost and I just couldn't find my way and I got lost. This sounds awesome. This sounds like they've refined everything from the original. And one thing we haven't touched on, which we will kind of end on as we segue into the final comments or whatever, is the presentation of it. It's one of the most immediately recognizable games of the last few years. And I feel like they've found such a great way of pivoting off the Soulsian open art style, being very much Dark Souls influence.
Yeah.
But Blasphemous art style is like so kind of like religious. It's kind of got all these like almost like European architecture influences to the level design. How's that stuff? How's the general, I guess, atmosphere and feel of it?
I mean, it's amazing. That's what you come to Blasphemous for, in my opinion. That was the thing that initially caught my attention with the first game. I remember seeing it on the PlayStation Store and just needing to know what this game was, because I was looking through the screenshots and I didn't even know how it played. I just thought that looks like something I've never seen before necessarily, and I wanted to see what else that game had to give me. It turns out
a big hat.
It had a lot. The man does still have a big hat. He's right there with his giant hat and his weird vines. But yeah, I mean, Blasphemous 2 was kind of more of the same, but again, it ups the scale, it ups the ambition of it. I mean, the area that you're exploring, you're kind of trying to get down this sort of city in the sky almost that's been held up by 3 statues, and just the visual of this kind of dark landscape with this kind of monolithic statue in the middle with a beating heart with something growing inside it right above it. You know, that's one of the first images you see, and it's so evocative. It stays with you so much, and the game is full of those. Each biome that you travel to is distinct. It's always offering a new group of freaks to kind of be repelled by. Some of the most...
Is that their in-game name?
Yeah. Some grotesque images, some absolutely twisted NPCs that are hidden around in the world that were a joy to explore, find, and then talk to. Like, it just has those images, it has those backdrops that it just allows it to stand out from the pack and give it that unique identity. I will admit, the one misstep in the presentation for me personally was the introduction of like these anime-style cutscenes where you have these cartoon aesthetics, essentially. To me, that jarred a little bit with the otherwise excellent pixel artwork. It just kind of felt a bit strange going from those cutscenes back to gameplay, because to me, the gameplay visuals are so good that I don't need that extra stuff. But that is probably more of a personal thing. A lot of people might get more mileage out of that. To me, it didn't quite mesh. But yeah, I think every single time I went to a new level, I just kind of like put the character down, took a few screenshots, and had a look around. There are some endgame ones, again, that I won't spoil here, that are just so cool, so memorable, that it elevates the gameplay.
I think one of the things I always love about like grand 2D artwork is you can have that fixed perspective. You can force a certain, like I said, perspective from the player, so you can guarantee you're going to see a certain vista. You're not relying on a 3D camera being placed in the right way or whatever it is. And the original Blasphemous had a lot of that too.
Yeah.
Closing thoughts or potentially a star rating? I don't know what you want to say.
I'd give it 4 out of 5, Scott Tilbert. I think it's a really good Metroidvania if you're into these types of games. If you look at the art style and you find it appealing, I think it's like just a great point to jump into this franchise. I will say the reason it doesn't get higher for me is because there is a lot of stuff reused from Blasphemous 1, and I kind of would have liked to have seen kind of fewer enemies brought over, for instance, or kind of changes made here and there, maybe go to a kind of completely different style of art at some point, perhaps. I will also say that later on in the game, things might get like a little bit repetitive, because eventually, although the enemy variety is great, at a certain point you kind of will be getting reskins of the enemies that you've already fought that kind of have slightly different magic attacks and are just slightly different color coded. Like, that's not a deal breaker by me, but I felt like I mastered a lot of the enemy encounters before I got to that end section. And like I said, there are also times, and this might be a me problem, it might be issues with my skill, where I just kind of got lost in the world, and it felt a little bit more frustrating than it maybe needed to be. But like I said, that stuff doesn't necessarily detract from the ambition on show and just how much fun I had with it. Like, I didn't expect to kind of just... It's such a Moorish game, and we talk about that quite a lot on this channel, but every time I jumped... Yeah, right. Every time I jumped into Blasphemous 2, it was that kind of, I'll do one more level. You know what I mean? I've just got this ability. I'll just go back to where I've just been and see what I can open up, and had that kind of, I don't want to go to bed, I just want to keep playing it mentality, which is really good, and it's kind of what you want from this genre, right?
Yeah, and also what you want from a sequel. I feel like this is one of those games where, like I said, the original was always very recommendable, but for whatever reason, I mean, I didn't finish it. But let us know what you think down in the comments below of Blasphemous in general, if you played the original, and what your thoughts are about Blasphemous 2 going into the game's launch very soon. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
I've been Josh from WhatCulture.com.
I'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Probably a video here as well.
Yeah.
Probably one there.
Probably.
See ya.